And just give me 1 minute and I will start the webinar here. Just making sure the live stream is up and we are all good. Okay, and I'm starting the webinar now.
Welcome to everybody. My name is Andrew Muravchuk. I'm director of the Liechtenstein Institute at Princeton University. I'm here simply beyond welcoming you to express how pleased we are to be launching this series on nationalism and current public policy with this group of distinguished scholars. The Liechtenstein Institute focuses on issues that combine both fundamental theoretical importance for social sciences and related disciplines and current policy importance. And this seems like a perfect issue from that point of view. What's more, we have a long tradition of working on transatlantic relations and particularly on EU affairs. So I'd like to offer a special welcome to a member of the European Parliament, Ponsati, for joining us in this, and a welcome to Mark Tushnet. We were just saying we hadn't seen each other in a while, but it's wonderful to have one of the world's leading scholars on the legal aspects of these issues. So I'm very excited to hear what you all have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, everyone that is joining us in this transatlantic seminar. Students at Princeton, students at many other universities, thanks for your interest. People from the European Parliament, members of the Parliament, assistants, and many other people that have joined us today. So thank you very much for your interest. And thanks, Andy, for your opening words. And thanks very much to the Institute, the Liechtenstein Institute, and to Professor Carles Bosch for letting me take part of this initiative. I am Clara Ponsati, member of the European Parliament, a Catalan member of the European Parliament, and I'm very happy to be here today. Let me just start very quickly by telling you what is the idea that inspires this series. The general principle of self-determination is part of the international legal order as recognized in the Foundational Chapter of the United Nations. But the practical implications of this right, or even the definition of the subjects that are entitled to this right, are not at all obvious. Much have been said and written on this matter, but beyond the implications for the colonial context, questions on the right of self-determination are still very, very open. Some advanced democracies have faced internal demands of self-determination from national community, most famously Canada and the United Kingdom, and they have chosen to organize referendum to settle them, while others, like Spain, adamantly deny their national communities any such right, given the relevance and the fundamental nature of questions of self-determination in relation to democratic principles. We believe that we should try to work out some consensus among democratic states, societies, and institutions on how to address them. So our aim with this seminar series is precisely to help in searching for this consensus and to provide answers, or at least some guidance, to the question, how should democratic societies and institutions address the question of self-determination? So once again, welcome everyone, and in particular to Professor Mark Tushnet, our speaker today, that couldn't be more distinguished to start our series, and that Carles Bosch will introduce to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy and Clara, for this introduction to our series. I would also like to thank again all of you for joining us today I'm sure this is going to be a wonderful, enlightening talk. Let me start with a few logistical details. Professor Tushnet will speak to us for probably about 35 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat box. Please write it there and send it to me, and I will forward the questions to our speaker. For your information, we are web streaming, and we are also recording the event, and it will be later available at the Institute's website. Let me say that I'm very excited about launching this series, and especially to be able to begin with such a distinguished speaker as Professor Tushnet. Professor Tushnet is the Emeritus William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law of Harvard Law School. He's a leading constitutional theorist and a very influential one. His scholarship spans to many areas of public law, including comparative constitutional law, institutions for protecting constitutional democracy, and constitutional history. He has also written on judicial review, and I believe today he will speak to us to the limitations of charging the court to make decisions on who is the subject of the right to self-determination. In a way, this is the fundamental, and I think a largely unresolved question. Who gets to decide the boundaries of the entity that in turn gets to decide about its national identity? Or as Professor Tushnet very appropriately puts it, who decides? Who decides? That's really a perfect starting point for our series on democratic governance and the question of self-determination. And so without further ado, Professor Tushnet, it's my great pleasure to give you the floor, or let's say the screen. And with that, let's get this started. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this opening session. Which provided me the opportunity to put into more concrete form some thoughts I've had as part of a larger project on what for me is I describe as the Foundations of Federalism. Whether I'm going to be able to execute the project entirely or not is unclear. It's the kind of thing that ordinarily would take me between 5 or 10 years to complete, and I'm just not sure that I have the either time or energy to do it. But I am pleased to be able to at least force myself to start on the project. My talk is 3 parts. The first is I'm sort of launched into already, an introduction framing the general issues that I'm interested in. The second, which may be a bit seemingly off tangent at the outset, but I think is actually quite important, is what does an entity get once it is self-determining? And I think the answer is that it gets in some ways less than its proponents might think, but in another sense, exactly what the proponents are looking for. Then the third part is the who decides a question, which is, I think, the animating issue today. The motivation for my larger project is to figure out what you get out of different forms of state organization, such as federalism or confederation or independence or a network of multilateral treaties or asymmetrical federalism. And one important component of the project is to take into account developments in what I think of as the technology of multi-level governance, in which in particular, the possibility of strong forms of asymmetrical federalism has become a real one. Now, my analytic framework is generally pretty abstract. And in particular, it omits path dependencies that I suspect are going to have the most impact on real world outcomes. On the other hand, in some sense, that's also the conclusion of my argument today, that intensely local circumstances are going to have the largest effect on outcomes. Now, I got to thinking about these issues in connection with, in sequence, Quebec, Scotland, the Basque region, and Catalonia. And I want to say at the outset that I am in some ways generally sympathetic to the claims of national self-determination in these areas, although not because I have attachments to either the idea of the nationalism in particular or the specific nationalisms of these regions, but more because I am attracted to the idea that smaller governments closer to their people are better than larger governments. I can't resist telling you an anecdote about my brief, call it intervention in connection with the Basque region. More than a decade ago it was, I was consulted by the then president of the region about what were then secessionist or self-determination pressures within the region with which the president was affiliated. And we had a discussion about what sort of steps might be taken. And after being pressed, working through some possibilities, I ended up giving advice that a decade or so later turned out to be counseling sedition in Spain. I suggested that if all else failed, if all other routes seemed blocked, the political party with which he was affiliated could sponsor a privately financed poll, referendum, advisory vote on independence for the Basque region, and then use the results of that poll for whatever political purposes it could be used. That, as I say, turns out to be at least very close to counseling sedition, according to the Spanish court. Now, the reason these areas are interesting to me is that they present the issues in a relatively pure form, that is, without the legacy of the sort of classic forms of 20th century colonialism that were associated with self-determination movements in the first instance, at Versailles with Woodrow Wilson, and then later, in particular, with Africa and parts of South Asia. Second, they occur in nations where the regions aren't grossly mistreated, in contrast, for example, to Indigenous people in Canada. The areas are relatively prosperous. And then there are two features that are important to what follows. First, these regions are likely to have continuing ties with the, I'll call it for the moment, host nation after independence. The terminological difficulties here are worth noting. In specific cases, it's easy to stabilize the terminology. So there's Quebec and the rest of Canada, which in the literature is abbreviated as ROC. And you can do the same with Scotland and England, for example, or Scotland and the United Kingdom. The general terminology is very difficult to come up with, and I'll use a variety of frames: larger, smaller, independence, pro-independence, and host, and the like. So again, now back to the main point, these regions are going to have continuing ties with the host nation, and second, they're likely to have continuing ties with other nations after independence. In the Quebec example, the relations will be with the United States and with France, among other places. In Catalonia, the relations will be with the rest of Spain and the European Union. And those last two sets of relations are important because they set what will turn out to be the key feature of the argument that I make. They set the bargaining context within which efforts to secure self-determination occur. Now, I do assume, as I've already indicated, that the goal of self-determination is the creation of an independent state of the standard sort. I wanted to say a state that could be admitted to the United Nations, but then I remembered that 3, I think, of the subnational units of the former Soviet Union were members of the United Nations, and that too turns out to be a non-trivial observation because their membership resulted from the bargaining position that the Soviet Union had at the time the United Nations was created. Now, a final preliminary, I'm going to assume that the entity seeking more self-determination already has some control over governance as a province or region within a larger entity. It's possible, and I know there are some cases where you have these self-determination movements in an entirely centralized government, but I'm going to focus on the existence of some degree of self-governance. One observation here that might be useful: consider devolution in the United Kingdom, leading to the current system of governance with respect to Scotland. That system came about because the Scottish National Party ran for seats in the Westminster Parliament of the United Kingdom before devolution and won enough seats or posed enough of a threat to the Labour Party in Scotland that the Labour Party found it in its own best interest to support devolution. That is, considerations of party politics within the then unitary government and power led to devolution. I would note that I think the underlying analysis is the same, even if the group that doesn't have some degree of self-governance as a regional government. It gets more complicated to explain, but again, the analysis turns on questions of political power. Okay, so that's the preliminaries. Now, the animating question for the first section of the talk is, what do you get when you become independent? Now, for present purposes, I divide the possibilities into 3 categories. Autonomous, that is your own ability to control policy outcomes, autonomous in the same sense, governance structures, and your identity as a nation among nations. The argument in this first part is that independence doesn't guarantee your autonomous ability to control policy outcomes. Or more precisely, it doesn't guarantee significantly greater autonomous ability to achieve those outcomes than you could have achieved within the prior system. So the argument is, were Quebec to become independent, it might not have much greater ability to determine its trade policy, the trade policy applicable to goods made or sold in Quebec, than it would have as a province within Canada, nor much greater ability to determine a distinctive foreign or national security policy. And I'm going to use trade and foreign and national security policies as my examples here. The reason for this conclusion, which I can't say I established, but I think I will at least motivate. The reason is that within Canada, the policies applicable to and in Quebec result from negotiations between Quebec and the rest of Canada. Again, just as Scottish devolution resulted from negotiations between the Scottish National Party and the parties in the rest of the United Kingdom. The result of those negotiations reflects, it's a very rough term, the relative power of the negotiating parties. It's not quite complete, as I indicated in my opening part, because there are other parties with an interest in Quebec's trade and foreign policies, nations other than the rest of Canada, in this example, the United States, for the European examples, the members of the EU, and with respect to both, Scotland and Catalonia, questions about the relations of an independent Scotland to the European Union were a significant part of the discourse over the independence referendum. To put it quite crudely, the United States isn't going to let Quebec have a national security policy dramatically different from the one the US has worked out with a unified Canada. There will be some difference on the margin, perhaps, for example, with respect to relations with France, but not much. And even here, a unified Canada is negotiated with the United States over these policies, that is, policies with respect to France, will reflect the power of Quebec within Canada to shape the policies. I note here, but don't want to do more, the possibility of having your own representation in international bodies if they let you. Again, the if they let you is significant because that will depend on, that's what I keep calling power relations or bargaining positions. The former Soviet republics, as an example, is relevant. Though distinguishable here, more interesting to me, is the role that the German Länder and the Faroe Islands have in the EU. As a matter of choice, which is to say, as a result of domestic bargaining, Germany and Denmark have allowed the Länder and the Faroe Islands to participate directly in some EU bodies. And at least at one point, when I knew this better than I do now, as to the Faroe Islands, Denmark allowed the Faroe Islands to have, Denmark and the EU, allowed the Faroe Islands to have EU policy different for the Faroe Islands and the rest of Denmark. Now, consider as a trade example the proposition that an independent Quebec might want favorable trade treatment of exports to and imports from France. And then think about the two relevant negotiations here, pre-independence within a unified Canada and post-independence with the rest of Canada. Quebec within Canada says we want favorable trade terms of that sort. The rest of Canada says, well, okay, but only if you give us something in return, like some sort of direct interprovincial transfer. Within Canada, some deal will be worked out, and the terms will reflect the relative power of Quebec and the rest of Canada. Now, my thought is that it doesn't seem to me that much changes if Quebec becomes independent. The only thing that's occurred to me, but you might enlighten me about others, is that an independent Quebec can simply walk away from the bargaining table if it doesn't like the terms that are being offered. But it seems to me within a unified Canada, the rest of Canada can walk away from the table if it doesn't like the terms. And so in either situation, both sides have an interest in striking a deal that reflects their, as I say, relative bargaining power. I'm not sure how to make much of this post-independence. The rest of Canada can say, and by the way, we're going to pressure the United States to treat you badly if you walk away, and our leverage on the United States and its power over you is much greater than your leverage over us, over France and its power over us. Now, I think that this bargaining analysis is going to work across all policy domains, as I've called them. Outcomes both within a unified Canada and between the rest of Canada and an independent Quebec will result from bargaining power that's largely unaffected by the formal status of independence. I don't have time to develop this here, but I think we saw the glimmerings of this during the most recent Scottish independence referendum campaign in connection with nuclear and national security policy. It's reasonably clear that Scotland on its own would be a nuclear weapons-free nation. But the only naval base in the United Kingdom has for nuclear submarines is in Scotland. Now, of course, we don't know what would have happened had Scotland become independent or had negotiations over independence gone forward. But I would have been shocked if the result would be closing that base in the short run, because Scotland needs England too much for it to make closing the base a strong component of its bargaining position. So to summarize a bit more formally, policy outcomes pre and post-independence result from the bargaining power of both parties, and neither one's bargaining power changes much as a result of a formal declaration of independence. Perhaps the threat of walking away becomes a bit more credible, or perhaps the ability to call upon outside allies increases a bit, but it's not clear to me that these are asymmetrical in a way that leads to more autonomous control after independence. Now, I can't say that I've established the proposition that independence doesn't guarantee significant increments in autonomous policy control, but I think that I've done enough to show why the argument for independence can't rest on strong claims with respect to it. Now, what about governance structures? Here, I think pretty much the same thing can be said, and here, the important point are these, what I called earlier, developments in the technology of governance. We now know that nations can have and live with asymmetrical federal systems with wide differences among the powers of subnational units, both internally and at the level of national governments. I won't go through the many variations, including guarantees of seats in decision-making bodies, control of specific policies and the like. Take systems of asymmetrical and complex federalism as our examples, and specifically Belgium. What's interesting to me about Belgium is the rapid succession of constitutional arrangements to deal with the nation's various communities, as they call them. Why have the arrangements shifted so much? Because I think the bargaining power of the communities has changed. That is, the contours of the governance systems of asymmetrical and complex federalism are turned once again by relative bargaining power. Although here I suppose I should note one possibility, probably best described as involving path dependency. There might be governance structures in place in the unified nation that result from habit rather than contemporary commitment, say the length of tenure of Constitutional Court judges. As a matter of contemporary choice, these might be matters as to if the unified nation is indifferent. And post-independence, you might end up seeing institutional innovation that wouldn't have occurred before, mostly because independence provides an occasion for thinking, rethinking the things that have become habitual. Now that leads me to my final category, the one that ultimately gives my presentations a title. The one thing that you do get from independence that you can't get within the prior system is what people call something like national self-identity. Within Quebec, within Canada, sorry, Quebecers can only be Quebecers within Canada, not Quebecers full stop. And for proponents of independence, that's precisely what they want. They want to be Quebecers without any reference to Canada. Now, to put it in the seminar's terms, the nation is the self that is to be self-determining. There's one obvious problem that's widely noted, but for which there are now solutions in the system of multi-level governance. Once the nation becomes independent, there are always going to be minorities within minorities. For Quebec Anglophones, This issue was mooted at Versailles in connection with Wilson's call for self-determination, so it goes back a long way. The interests of the minorities within minorities have to be protected. That was the issue of concern at Versailles. Their interests have to be protected, but now we know that multilateral human rights treaties can and do so. And they can give individuals access to institutions to protect those rights. And so as a matter of human rights protection, the design issues are, for all practical purposes, solved. But the minorities within minorities problem points to an antecedent difficulty, which does indeed get me to the who decides question, the third part of my talk. For present purposes, we're assuming that the group seeking self-determination is embedded geographically within a larger entity, Quebec within Canada. I note that the arrangement for Belgians communities opens up the possibility of creative non-geographic modes of governance, including a wide array of distribution of competences among such communities. I won't explore that here. I think it is a part of the larger project, and I think quite a difficult one. It's been difficult for me to get my head around, and so I don't have anything to say about it. In our core case, we now have the core case of a province or a region within a larger entity. We now have two candidates for self-determination. The region we started with, Quebec, and Canada. And there are a bunch of sub-identities within each of those candidates. As I put it earlier, Quebecers full stop, Quebecers who see themselves as Quebecers first, but also Canadians. People within Quebec who see themselves as Canadians, full stop. People in the rest of Canada who see themselves as Canadian, full stop. And interesting, people in the rest of Canada who see themselves as proud members of a multinational Canada that includes Quebec. Now, as far as I can tell, no one's been able to identify a principled way to decide between the two candidates for national self-determination. Quebec as a whole, including Quebec, or Quebec alone, in the cases of interest, that is, non-colonialism and no gross oppression. And I think I feel compelled to add a sort of footnote here that the metaphors of colonialism and oppression do rattle around in the discourse of independence in Quebec and Scotland, but they are, I think, mostly metaphors designed to invoke, but I think unsuccessfully, the issues of self-determination for what were, in my view, truly colonial and oppressive systems. Now, the obvious fallback position, if you don't have a principle to say, well, the self-determining entity should be Canada, or it should be Quebec. If you don't have a principled position to do that, the obvious fallback, at least for a lawyer, is to look for some process rooted in some principle that would choose between the candidates. And it's clear, this is standard, three candidates: a political process, meaning negotiations between the two groups, a judicial process, and some sort of supranational process. Now, the last two are designed, that is, the judicial process and the supranational process. These are designed to get some perspective that's in some sense above the contending sides. In the judicial context, what is above the contending sides is something like law of some sort. In the transnational process, supranational process, what is above the domestic process are all the other folks who are going to be making the decision. It should be clear, I think, that a domestic judicial process isn't going to be satisfactory. First, the advantage of a judicial process is that the judges will advert to some principle, the law, for choosing between the two candidates, basically between unilateral decision-making by the embedded group or negotiation. But I've suggested there aren't such principles available. And second, the domestic judicial process will inevitably be the court system of the larger entity. And from the point of view of the embedded group, Quebec, that's not above the dispute in any acceptable sense. At the moment, I think that the absence of principles is also a problem for the supranational process, although, again, I have to do some more thinking about this. I do think that it's interesting that the International Court of Justice's decision on the Kosovar unilateral Declaration of Independence basically threw up its hand. It said, you can declare your independence without violating international law, but doing so has no consequences whatsoever on the international scene. Okay, so if I've ruled out a domestic judicial process because it doesn't have law to apply and because it's domestic and therefore not above the process, and a supranational process because it also doesn't have principles to apply, that leaves negotiations, which is where the one major decision of a court comes out, the Canadian secession reference case. What it says is that if there's a clear majority on a clear question, the rest of Canada has to, on clear majority in Quebec on a clear question of independence, the rest of Canada has to engage in good faith negotiations. That decision was followed up by the adoption of what's known in Canada as a Clarity Act, designed to identify what would count as a clear majority and what would count as a clear question. It's not clear to me that Quebec actually accepts the Clarity Act. It was contentious in its presentation in the first place. But, and this returns me to my overall theme, whether negotiations even take place, and if they do, how they develop is going to depend upon the relative power positions of the two groups. And even the secession references attempt to specify some conditions for getting negotiations going might not be needed. The embedded entity, again, Quebec's negotiating position will be weakened if an independent gets a narrow majority or if participation in the independence referendum is strikingly low. So, for example, if there's an organized boycott by Anglophones of the independence referendum, so you get an 80% majority, a clear majority on a clear question, but with a participation rate of 43%. Quebec is not going to be in a good position to negotiate independence under those conditions. Now, I'm going to conclude with an observation about some possible solutions to the issue created by the diversity of perspectives about national identity, both within the larger entity and the embedded one. It's based on my admiration for the constitutional design genius, as I think of it, of Pierre Trudeau. In my view, he was one of the 20th century's greatest constitutional designers available. I have another, on a par with, for me, as an American, I have to say, on a par with James Madison. On my account, Trudeau figured out that the only solution to the problem of Quebec within Canada was to reconfigure Canada's national identity. And he used the patriation of the Canadian Constitution as the occasion for doing that job, doing just that. On my view, the key to the charter was recasting Canada as a multicultural nation within which Quebec fit comfortably. And the key to that move was actually not about Quebec, but the recognition of Canada's Indigenous peoples as full participants in Canada, and the recognition of Toronto and Vancouver as world cities. Now, as far as I can tell, that really did solve the issue of Quebec's status. Now, think about the embedded community, Scotland, say. What might be needed is a political leader who figures out how to present a nation, Scotland, as a nation of Scots proud of their historic connection to England and honoring the continuing legacy of England within Scotland. Doing so might satisfy both those now opposed to independence within Scotland, because they get to retain a version of their identity as Britons, and it might satisfy Britons and Scots, rather, and it might satisfy those in England who want to preserve some imagined connection with Scotland. But as I've said, Pierre Trudeau was a constitutional genius, in my view. And Nicola Sturgeon, while clearly a quite effective political leader, hasn't shown yet that she is or can take advice from someone who is so astute about constitutional design as Trudeau was. So that's basically my talk. My final words are drawn from a Nobel Prize winner for literature. As I indicated at the outset, I'm basically sympathetic to the various claims for self-determination that I've adverted to, but proponents of self-determination have a long and difficult process of political negotiation to engage in, part of which will involve negotiation over the very question of national self-identity that is the one thing that they can get out of the one, as my first argument was, it's the one thing they can get out of independence. That too is going to have to be part of the negotiation process. And they should see it in just those terms, a long-term process of negotiation. I don't want to contend that that they don't see it that way. For political, rhetorical purposes, they may well present issues as in campaign slogan, independence now, while recognizing that even if they persuade people to support a campaign for independence now, it's not going to happen right away. It will happen as a result of a long-term process. But for at least analytic purposes, the key point is that we're dealing with bargaining processes and relative political power. Now, the quotation from the Nobel Prize winner in literature actually points somewhat in the other direction. It's Bob Dylan, if you gotta go, go now, or else you gotta stay all night. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps you should mute your So thank you for this very thought-provoking talk. I have one question from Andy Moravchik, and I'm going to read it. So the question goes like this: while independence does not necessarily guarantee bargaining outcomes, empirically, certainly it can do so. Consider the example of Ukraine, which is in almost every respect different than it would be if it were still part of Putin's Russia. Exactly its pattern of foreign trade, the imminent cause of the conflict, and its international security policy. It is at war with Russia, not to mention its constitutional order, its relations with the EU and the US, in short, almost everything. Why? because one, Ukraine and Russia had the opposed interests, so no counterfactual bargain could take place. Two, Ukraine has outside allies more powerful than Russia who helped. If this is true for Ukraine, why not for most other post-colonial cases, e.g. Singapore, all the former FSU, Bangladesh, Kosovo? So the question is, don't we need better empirical theory to distinguish where change can take place or not?
I need to think more about those examples, but for me, the key is, at least in the question, is the reference to outside allies. That is, Ukraine was able to achieve, this is obviously sketchy and omits what I keep calling path dependencies, but Ukraine was able to achieve its policy outcomes because it was able to say to Russia, look, you can't impose these things on us, because if you try, the United States is going to come down hard on you. And we know that, and you know that. I need to, I need to think more about the one other case that I know reasonably well, which is Singapore. Singapore is an interesting case because, as at least experienced by Singapore, there's this dramatic video of Lee Kuan Yew on the night what he understood to be Singapore's expulsion from Malaysia occurred, the Federation. Singapore, as he's crying, sobbing. Singapore didn't want to be independent. It was thrown out of the Federation, and so in some ways, the interesting feature of the case would be, well, what happened in Malaysia? And one way, so Singaporean independence is a case of Malaysian self-determination, not Singaporean self-determination. I need to think more about that. And I don't know enough about Malaysia to say anything within the framework that I've developed.
So thank you. There are no other questions at this point, so I'm going to, in a way, abound or pile up on Andy's question. So in a way, if I understood your thesis, is that pre-independence and post-independence are going to be similar because all depends on the relative bargaining power of, let's say, both sides. So there is a majority and a minority. And so the incentives to become independent are not clear. So I think that this seems to work well if we assume that you have probably equal parties, or rational parties, or parties that need each other because they are complementary in some ways. They hate with each other, things like that. And then, of course, they negotiate, and they sort of, negotiate over time, and they kind of accommodate to the new things, so to as things evolve in the relative bargaining position, they renegotiate the constitutional deal. So in a way, there is no incentive to secede. But then, not all cases are like this. There are cases where a large majority opposes secession, opposes negotiation. And if I take, if I accept your, your position, then it seems to me that you are basically legitimizing the impossibility of secession. that, your point seems to be, perhaps I misunderstood it, that given that the minority, is kind of weak and the majority is very powerful, then, well, the same kind of relationship will be reproduced would be reproduced in the post-independence case, although this post-independence moment will never happen because the majority has no incentive to renegotiate any kind of constitutional deal. So I'm trying to struggle here because it seems to, in a way, reinforce status quos, basically exclude the possibility of legitimate secessions. Almost in retrospect is telling us, but again, I may misunderstand your position, is telling us that a lot of secessions that happened were, well, it's difficult to rationalize them in some way.
So I just, as I understand the point, it is that take the Canadian example. Suppose large majorities in the rest of Canada oppose Quebec independence. They won't be interested, the rest of Canada won't be interested in sitting down at the bargaining table with Quebec, even if there's a large majority, a clear majority on a clear question in Quebec in favor of secession. And maybe that's why the secession reference might have some effect. It says, if there is a clear majority and a clear question, no matter how much the rest of Canada opposes it, it has to bargain, negotiate in good faith. It seems to me that in those situations, it's not a question of the legitimacy of the secessionist movement. It's a question of their ability to pull it off. So let's say that as a matter of, this is very hard for me to imagine, but as a matter of international law, Quebec, under the circumstances I've described, 80% clear majority on a clear question, is entitled to be independent of the rest of Canada. So they declare independence and they say, here's what our policies are going to be. And the rest of Canada, which by a large majority opposes secession, says, fine, those are the policies you want. We're going to impose a trade boycott on you. And so we're just going to starve you. And then the now independent Quebec, independent because as a matter of law, it's entitled to be independent, says, wait a minute, we got to do something about this. Here's how we're going, here are the concessions we will make so that the boycott will be removed or eased. And so even in the event of, in your terms, a legitimate secession as a matter of international law, the policy outcomes are going to result from this kind of negotiation. I actually think that that's the situation that worked, that I don't know worked, but that eventuated in connection with Kosovo. Yeah, Kosovo declared its independence, and the International Court of Justice said, fine, you can do that. You're entitled to do that. Now you got to work out what your relation to the former Yugoslavia, the other former, what you got to work out what your relation to your neighbors are. And your neighbors are very opposed to what you're trying to do. So those negotiations are going to be very difficult for you. And they were. Now I think things have worked out, but it's not, my claim is that the ultimate contours of the policy, even after a legitimate secession, legitimate independence, the ultimate contours of policy are going to reflect the power relations between the rest of Canada and Quebec, the rest of the former Yugoslavia and Albania and Kosovo and the like. So I don't think it's a pro status quo position. It's a position saying that you shouldn't be, if you are in favor of independence, you shouldn't go into it with an exaggerated sense of the ability, your ability to secure what I called autonomous control over policy as a result of independence. What you will get is a national identity. And then you have to figure out what do you do about the folks inside who, the 40% who didn't want to secede. How do you make them part of your community? Again, a footnote here, yeah, there is the obvious but completely unattractive solution of just saying, no, you're not part, go away. I mean, that's the what happened in partition in India, and it was not a good thing.
Thank you. I have two people. One is Andy, who is, I think replying to your last comment. So I'm going to read this first, and then I have someone else who basically asks for a comment. I'm going to read first Andy's. So the message. Andy says, I really don't understand this. Even if succession does not change bargaining relations with the home country, it changes its outside options with other countries. That's the modern theory of international power that just seems to restate the question more rigorously, but does not answer it. Because the other comment went first, but I just wanted to introduce the sort of two-finger comment of Andy. Let me also read the other comment from one of our guests. He says, he writes, or she writes, since I cannot, I don't know. In Quebec, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau is not viewed as a constitutional genius. He is viewed as someone that has imposed a constitution on Quebec without the consent of the government, parliament, and people of Quebec. And his 1982 Constitution Act has never been accepted in Quebec. If he is a genius, he's a very undemocratic genius. And the message ends saying a comment. So
yep.
I let you, decide which one you want to comment on or answer to first.
So I'll just briefly, as Trudeau, I understand the nature of the claim, and it is true that the official position of Quebec and of many Quebecers is that the charter was imposed on them. But it's also the case that, as far as I can tell, the issue of Quebec has fallen off the Canadian political radar screen to the point where, if I have this right, the Parti Québécois was the official opposition for a while in Canada and participated as the official opposition in Canadian governance. So again, while it's true that the formal position, so my claim about Trudeau is not that he persuaded Quebec about the constitutional arrangements, but that on the ground, he seems to have succeeded in reconfiguring Canadian national identity in a way that satisfied enough Quebecers to remove, at least for the moment, the Quebec issue from national politics. Now, there is, continuing contention over how extensively Quebec can pursue its distinctive culture and whether their use of the Canadian override provision is lawful and the like. But for me, that's just using law as part of the negotiating process over time, and we'll see what happens. I guess now, as to Andy's observation, I guess I am puzzled because I'm still it's not. I understand the outside option point, but I don't understand how independence changes the outside option. That is, imagine a Ukraine within Russia that wants to establish relations with the United States that are different from, and the EU or whatever, but the outside folks that are different from the ones Russia wants Ukraine to have. Now, post-independence, Ukraine, Russia, and the United States work out a deal of some sort on these assumptions favorable to Ukraine. Pre-independence, Ukraine as part of unified Russia, Ukraine says to the United States, here's the deal we want to have with you. Russia says it's illegal, and we're going to bring the full force of our legal system, including the possibility of the military, against you. And then the United States says, no, don't do that, because we support Ukraine as we would after independence. So it's just not, I don't get again, there will be some, I want to say, marginal differences. I don't deny that. But I don't see the dramatic change, how independence works, a dramatic change in the outside options.
I do not see any other questions at this point. I have many, so I'll ask them and see if someone wants to join me. Again, I'm still a bit puzzled by your points. If they, I understand they are not about, let's say, a theory of justice, but rather about practicality or the empirics of independence. In any case, even in that sense, let me give you two examples that seem to point to differences in terms of what independence does. So we have a growing literature in development that seems to point to the fact that states that were not colonized, so they maintain some sort of domestic institutions, are doing better. They were able to avoid most of the effect of foreign control. And so I think that points to, some value of being a sovereign country. The second example is completely different. It's about linguistic policy. For example, in Europe, Catalan is spoken by a lot of people, more people than many of, some linguistic groups that have their own states are a part of the European Union. Yet the Spanish government blocks any attempt at making Catalan an official language in the European Parliament. Now, saying that the status quo is the way it is, and therefore nothing can be done because, if Catalonia were independent and part of the European Union, it would be basically the same now, or that this cannot happen because, it's too weak and the other states of the European Union would not accept an independent Catalan state. Still, it leaves me very unsatisfied or unhappy, about this, this, right? It seems that being independent or being an equal within a union matters. But in any case, I have a completely different question, which is the following one. I would like to pick your brain on this. And it's the following one. In this question of who decides, I agree with you that judicial power is not perhaps the best way to solve this for the questions that you about, domestic courts being part of are embedded in the constitutional system as it is, and the international court, even if it gives the right to secede, naturally recognition is fundamental. But there is an example in the case of Switzerland. In the 70s, there was a growing movement within the Bern canton of Jura people that wanted to establish their own canton. At the beginning, the Bernois or the authorities in Bern resisted this growing secessionist movement, if you will, of Jura. But then the Federal Council of the Swiss Confederation intervened and basically persuaded, lobbied the Bern canton to change its constitution and finally they sort of kind of moved everyone to a referendum that led to the formation of a different, separate canton, the Jura canton. So what do you think about this? And do you think that the European Union could play the same role in other cases within the Union? Did you, Professor Tushnet?
Yeah, right. Sorry.
Did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought perhaps my system had gone down or something.
Yeah, no. Let me take the Swiss example, the details of which I'm familiar with, so I'm just working from your description. So am I right in thinking that Jura wanted to become a separate canton from Bern, and Bern was resisting the separation? And then the Federal Council intervened and said, Bern, you have to let them hold a referendum or something like that?
Yes, exactly. So there was a growing secessionist movement in Jura.
Okay.
They went to a referendum.
Yeah. So the answer is
after the Federal Council convened.
Yeah. So with your question is, could the EU play the same role with respect to Catalonia in Spain or Scotland within the United Kingdom? And I think the answer is clearly yes, it could. It could play that role. Not, my view is not by invoking some, they would do so. Sorry, this now gets complicated. This draws on my views about how law works. They would invoke some legal principle about the fundamentals of self-determination and justice and the like. But they would be effective only if they were willing to deploy whatever I would call them power resources they have available to induce England to allow Scotland to become an independent nation. And so my thesis is, now to your second point about linguistic policy, if the EU were to say to Spain, we are going to allow Catalan to be a language in the European Parliament, an official language of the EU. What are you going to do about it? And Spain would say, well, whatever we'll do, and and the EU would say, okay, go ahead and try, but we just have more economic resources than you, and we can hold out. And that seems to me, parallel to the situation of in the Swiss case. That is, this their cantonal body said, you, Bern, have to let them do that. And if you don't, we're going to do some bad stuff to you. Okay, so I think that the other than on issues of policy, I'm just not clear that, again, except for issues on the margins, or issues as to which one of the sides is indifferent, a point I mentioned, I just don't see that there are dramatic differences between what you get on the issue on policy autonomy, including linguistic policy, from independence that you couldn't get. So your independence is conditioned on a set of power relations between you and a whole bunch of other people. If those power relations exist, it doesn't seem to me, or are just short of existing, it doesn't seem to me that you couldn't get those same policy outcomes within the unified nation. You don't have, you're just short of enough power to become independent, but you're pretty powerful. And so you can extract stuff on the policy level from the rest of the country. Again, I want to say what you can't get is a national self-identity. I mean, that I want to make it clear. That is the one thing that you do get out of independence. But then you have to face the issue of how you craft your national self-identity in a way that takes account of what is inevitably the pluralism within this now independent nation. On the development point, either I want to say that's an example of path dependency, or that it's that because of the historical setting, the variable that it identifies independence as of 1880 is not relevant, maybe a little too strong, to the situation of the nations of interest here. So just to, it's hard for me to imagine that Quebec, Scotland, or Catalonia would explode into economic development were they to become independent in ways that they haven't been successful, in ways that haven't occurred already within the rest of Canada or the United Kingdom or Spain. So I'm skeptical about the relevance of those studies for the cases of interest here. In this discussion, there may be examples of under or retarded development in places where there are currently independence movements that could be freed up. But I guess I want to, the condition I imposed at the beginning, my guess is that most of those cases probably involve situations of what I call gross oppression or traditional forms of colonialism. And there, I think the case for independence is entirely independent of the kinds of things that I've talked about. I think the positive description, are you going to succeed, is probably the same, but the international community in those situations may be much more supportive of the independence movement. So that's a sort of rambling response to the development issue, but there it is.
Thank you. Again, I do not see any questions. We are at the end of our time. We said we take about 80 minutes, so it's almost 11:20 in Princeton and 5:20 p.m. in the continent, in European continent. Thank you for this, very, very interesting talk. That, what I get from it, I get many things, and I enjoyed it immensely. It seems to me that the message is that those that do not need to be independent do not become independent because they have a master with whom they can, basically renegotiate the deal they have. And then those that cannot be independent really want to be independent, but they cannot. And, and that's a, I don't know if a paradox or a problem, but, I thank you very much. I think this is a fantastic start of a series that we will continue to hold. The next one takes place on November 19th, and we'll have Professor Stephen Turney, who is at the School of Law, University of Edinburgh, and we'll sort of go back into these questions of self-determination. Again, thank you to everyone, and thank you especially to Professor Tushnet for being here with us.
Thank you very much. As I say, I think your phrasing of the paradox is actually quite nice. I like those kinds of formulations. So thank you.
Thank you to you.